Peace and blessings, dear FBA family and friends. And I see some enemies. I am your brother and host, Dr. Muhammad, and you're tuned in to the Dr. Muhammad Files, where we break down the real issues in a scholarly, civil, and unapologetic, truthful way. So, this is episode 3 in our series. And today we're engaging chapter 3 of Dr. Joe Feagin's pivotal work, How Blacks Built America: Labor, Culture, Freedom, and Democracy. Chapter 3 is called Black Genius Shaping U.S. Culture. So, FBA family and friends, for generations, the white racist imagination has labeled foundational black Americans and Native Americans with terms like savages, while simultaneously painting white Americans as so called saviors. But Dr. Feagin flips that narrative. In this chapter, he reveals what mainstream history often conceals: the intellectual, artistic, scientific, and cultural brilliance of foundational black Americans. A brilliance that has shaped, enriched, and helped build the very foundation of this nation. So when we talk about civilization, innovation, and cultural leadership, we must speak truth to power. So the Africans who were enslaved in North America, who intermingled with black natives and others during a process of ethnogenesis, became a distinct people. Who are those people? Foundational black Americans. And what they brought was far more than labor. They brought genius, musical genius, scientific genius, cultural genius that continues to define what America is today. So let that settle in. This chapter urges us, FBA family, friends, and yes, you enemies, to recognize and reclaim what whitewashed history has long tried to erase. I had a commenter just recently talk about the word reclaiming and that we don't need to reclaim anything. Well, yes, we do need to reclaim it because the dominant society, oftentimes in the past, have whitewashed history and try to erase our ethnicity, our lineage, and our culture. It challenges us to reconsider who the real architects of American culture are. So let's get started.
Brothers and sisters and friends, and I see some enemies. In fact, I think we'd be fooling ourselves if we had an audience this large and didn't realize that there were some enemies present. In fact, I'm a black nationalist freedom fighter. The political philosophy of black nationalism only means that the black man should control the politics and the politicians in his own community. The time when white people can come in our community and get us to vote for them so that they can be our political leaders and tell us what to do and what not to do is long gone. By the same token, the time when that same white man, knowing that your eyes are too far open, can send another Negro into the community, get you and me to support him so he can use him to lead us astray, those days are long gone.
We begin the first powerful subsection of chapter 3 entitled Co-workers in the Kingdom of Culture. Here, Dr. Feagin, he emphasizes that foundational Black American cultural contributions aren't just add-ons to American society, they are central and foundational. As one scholar noted, Black American culture, from clothing, dance, and hairstyling to music, language, and worship, has not only shaped U.S. society, but has influenced cultures around the world. This isn't appropriation by accident. It's Black cultural genius that has long set the global standards. When you go overseas, you see people imitating foundational Black Americans, from the dress to the slang. Everything that you would equate to American is Black American culture that they're trying to imitate. He says, Dr. Feagin, as one expert lately put it, various aspects of the contemporary culture of, he uses the misnomer African American. I talked about this previous podcast. I'll quote when they're using African American, but we no longer identify as African American. Um, so African American, including clothing, dance, hairstyling, music, song, speech, and worship, have spread to many corners of the globe. Excuse me. Feagin challenges the white racist framing that often marginalizes these cultural creations, insisting that they may be seen not as fringe or derivative, but as sovereign expressions of a people who have been he called them co-creators in the American cultural landscape since the nation's beginning. But I would even go a step further and say we were the creators, and they may have been the co-creators by stealing it, but that's not the creators, right? Feagin goes on to say one aspect of this kingdom of cultural reality is that, he uses the misnomer again, African American culture creation should not be viewed as just appendages tacked onto the dominant culture, but as co equal cultural efforts. But, FBA family, friends, and yes, you enemies, to fully understand this kingdom of culture, as he calls it, we must go deeper into the roots, not just African, right? Because a lot of times the liberal scholars, and I'll talk about this on the further podcast, they just equate everything that foundational Black Americans have created to African. But the unique ethnogenesis that gave rise to foundational Black Americans, while some enslaved African arrives with elements of their heritage intact, like including language, religion, and even Arabic literacy, the brutal realities of slavery included systemic rape, cultural erasure, and forced breeding disrupted these original ties. Therefore, the commingling of the Black natives that were already here, the rape by the slave master, and the Africans that were brought here created an ethnogenesis. And we talked about this in earlier podcasts, so we won't go too far into that. But over time, through a violent and complex process of mixing with the Black natives, the red natives, the Europeans, and others, a distinct people emerge. A people born out of resistance and resilience. Foundational Black Americans. In fact, in Dr. Feagin's book, Systemic Racism, A Theory of Oppression, he averred the rape of Black women was widespread in many areas of this country during the long slavery era. Although most white analysts, then as now, have not been willing to openly grant and assess the significance of this brutal reality. During slavery, many African American women were raped by white slave masters, overseers, sailors, slave traders, and slave catchers. These included, as we have seen, some of the white founders and their close relatives. Under the gendered racial oppression of the day, the children resulting from the sexual attacks were automatically labeled or automatically Black and were normally enslaved. often by their own fathers. Let that sit in on you, FBA family, friends, and USU enemies who are revisionists of history. Oftentimes, the white slave master would come in, sexually assault the enslaved people, the black people, have children, they call them mulattoes, and then enslave those his own children. How sick can you be? Feagin goes on, it is likely that no other U.S. racial group's makeup has been so substantially more than half of this country's total history. Now, Dr. Feagin does acknowledge aspects of this in his broader work in Systemic Racism, a Theory of Oppression. He confronts the harrowing truth of racial sexual violence during slavery, a truth too often ignored, even by liberal, so-called liberal scholars. Dr. Feagin, documents how the bodies of black women were weaponized by the system, resulting in generations of children born into bondage. Children whose very existence speaks to the horrors of white dominance and the ethnogenesis of a new, distinct lineage. Foundational black Americans. He went on, the data are incontestable, and the evidence can be seen in something as apparently innocuous as 19th century census data, which, for example, shows for 1850 hundreds of thousands of lighter skinned, again they call them mulattoes, among African Americans, and in the accounts of enslaved women and men. This is why we must move beyond the simplistic framing of Africans in America. Foundational black Americans, I'll repeat it on probably every broadcast, are not Africans. We are a unique and distinct ethnic group forged in the furnace of American slavery, colonial violence, and cultural survival. So, as we explore this chapter in this chapter 3, Black Genius Shaping U.S. Culture, keep in mind, FBA family, friends, and the enemies watching, what we're really looking at is the genius of a people born right here, a people who transform trauma into art, pain into power, and silence into song. Foundational Black American, descendants of freedmen. One of the clearest, most enduring reflections of foundational Black American ingenuity is we always know about or hear about is music. Foundational Black Americans, musicians, not only pioneered entire genres from spiritual and blues to jazz and hip hop, but also made significant contributions, and I didn't know this, to classical traditions such as opera and concert performance. Ironically, even within the racist framework of blackface minstrels, black musical excellence broke through, exposing white audiences to foundational Black Americans' rhythms, storytelling, and stage presence. Elements that would permanently go on to influence American culture. This presentation, this podcast, explores the deep legacy and cultural power of Black music, from sacred spirituals to the trailblazing role of Black women in the blues, while also confronting the exploitation, appropriation, and denial of Black influence in dominant culture. Some of the key themes that we'll talk about is Black minstrel, white racism and musical theft, spiritual music of life, resistance, and respect, blues, the central role of women, dominant culture's impact in the early 20th century, and lastly, we'll wrap up this section of it, enduring cultural effects of Black music and musicians. So first, we'll tackle blackface minstrel, white racism, and musical theft. As we all know, family, friends, and I'm sure you enemies are aware as well, The dominant society has always stolen FBA creation. So, as we examine the roots of American music, it's impossible to ignore the role of racism and cultural appropriation in shaping public entertainment. One of the earliest and most glaring examples is the emergence of blackface minstrel, a deeply racist anti black performance tradition that also served as a major vehicle for the theft and commodification of black musical expression. Sociologist Dr. Feagin highlights the origins of this exploitation. He says, from at least the 1700s onward, enslaved African Americans, there he goes again with that misnomer, were often encouraged or forced by slaveholders to sing, dance, and be musical. Feagin further explains how this coerced artistry became a source for white mimicry and misappropriation. Moreover, he says, Dr. Feagin, moreover, with great regularity, whites have borrowed heavily from black musical styles and patterns, most often without overt attribution. One of the most conspicuous examples of substantial white theft of black music, musicality, and dance is that of the white minstrels, whose blackface shows provided popular entertainment for millions of whites from the 1820s to the late 1800s. Minstrel shows were the first distinctively American theatrical performance, and most early minstrel companies, he says, were all white. This contradiction, FBA family, of racist exclusion alongside deep cultural borrowing reveals a foundational truth in American performance history. Black creativity has always been indispensable, even as it was systematically exploited. The legacy of minstrels is set a precedence for ongoing cultural appropriation. So from that time period forward, the dominant society believes that it should take everything from Black American. It owns it. It's their natural order to take whatever foundational Black Americans have or have created. One that it still echoes in modern media and music today. So, following the exploitation seen in blackface minstrels, it is essential to center the authentic voices and expressions of foundational Black Americans, particularly those of the enslaved whose music carried deep spiritual and cultural meaning. This spiritual and cultural meaning goes to every genre, including hip hop, and we'll get to hip hop in a minute. Unlike the distorted representations crafted by white performers, spirituals emerged as a profound form of self expression, survival, and resistance within the Black communities. Dr. Joe Feagin explains, since the 19th century, the African American, I cringe every time I say that, FBA family. The African American music that has had perhaps the greatest spiritual impact on Americans of diverse backgrounds has been that of the spirituals, the creative sorrow songs set long ago by talented enslaved Americans to often poignant melodies. But the depth of spiritual goes far beyond their influence on the broader public. Feagin emphasizes their unique meaning within the Black community. He says, the spirituals had a different meaning for African Americans, whether enslaved or free, than they had for most whites. They expressed the deep pain and emotions stemming from the severe tortures of enslavement and were usually distinctive in how little they directly reference white slaveholders and slavery. Indeed, The pain and hope expressed in the spirituals often were set in, as Lawrence Levin puts it, a social reference group of only African American relatives and fellow religionists. Those enslaved thus created significant musical spiritual distance from their oppressors, once again, creating authentic and independent African American selves. So, in this way, spirituals were more than songs, they were coded messages, prayers for freedom, and declarations of black humanity in the face of dehumanization. See, we often use music even to convey messages. They continue to resonate as some of the earliest and most powerful expressions of an enduring cultural identity, rooted in hope, dignity, and faith. So while spirituals emerge as sacred expressions of hope and survival during slavery, the blues marked a new phase in black musical evolution, one that voiced the complexity of everyday life in the post emancipation and Jim Crow eras. Building on the emotional depth of spirituals, the blues offered a raw, secular sound rooted in resistance, storytelling, and personal truth. So the blues piggybacked, for lack of better words, off of spirituals. Dr. Feagin highlights this continuity between spiritual and the blues by saying, as Sterling Stuckey underscores, those enslaved courageously, if often subtly, attacked the slavery system in their bluesy spiritual generations before the blues were named as a distinct genre. So before it was even named as blues, we were creating the blues. Just like with hip hop. You have to understand, FBA family, friends, and you enemies, we created hip hop from other genres. Jim Brown, oh, I'm sorry, James Brown, sorry, James Brown talks about he was the first one to rap. So we ask those who are trying to steal hip hop, specifically the Latinos and the Caribbeans, where show us where in the 30s, 40s, 50s did you have anything remotely close to rap or hip hop? But anyway, I digress. Dr. Feagin says he goes on to connect the genre's development to changing social conditions during Jim Crow. He says Jim Crow segregation replaced slavery with slavery like economic and political conditions. But as the scholar Angela Davis has noted, most people gain more personal freedom in travel, securing education, developing family relationships, and exploring sexuality and relationships of their choosing. Together with the harsh Jim Crow experiences, these life experiences provided sources of commentary in the musical innovations of blues, blues based gospel. See how gospel now goes on to the blues, and jazz, which was created out of the blues. You see how everything piggybacks, and then funk was created. Then out of funk, you had hip hop, you had rap music. Crucially, and here's the point, another point to this segment, black women were the originators and first stars of the blues. Feagin notes, indeed, black female blues singers were the first to make important recordings in the 1920s. Although later on, male blues singers came to dominate the genre. So this early dominance by black women like Ma Rainey, one of my favorites, Bessie Smith, and others, was not just musical, but cultural and political. It sometimes had a cultural, but it also sometimes had a political message. So through the blues, they claimed space to speak truthfully about love, loss, oppression, and autonomy, laying the foundations for generations of artists across all genres. Building on the groundbreaking influence of black women in the blues and the deep emotional legacy of spirituals, the early 20th century witnessed an even broader cultural shift. Black musical innovation began to shape not only American culture but also global soundscapes. So we were the influence around the world as early as the 1900s. Despite ongoing racial oppression, foundational black Americans continued to pioneer new genres. It wasn't because we weren't being oppressed or because there weren't anti-black racism. It was despite that, right? So we continue to pioneer new genres such as ragtime, jazz, and gospel, which redefine the artistic and the emotional landscapes of modern music today. Dr. Joe Feagin highlights this culture explosion. He says, since the early 20th century, African American music, especially spirituals, blues songs, ragtime, jazz, has had recurring and extensive impacts on popular and classical music of the larger society and on societies across the globe. Literary scholar James Weldon Johnson, he offered insight into the unique creativity or the creative force behind this influence. Our dear brother James Weldon Johnson says, this power of the Negro to suck up the national spirit from the soil. So you see, FBA family and friends, we have this terminology, and I probably shouldn't be telling you this. We get it from the soil, which means we created this. We are the foundation. This power of the Negro to suck up the national spirit from the soil and create something artistic and original, which at the same time possesses the note of universal appeal, is due to a remarkable racial gift of adaptability. Mm, let that set in. FBA are the only ones who have adapted to such environments. It is more than adaptability, though, he says. It is a transfusion quality. Feagin continues, noting how white musicians and composers were deeply impacted, often without acknowledgement. They didn't give us any credit. That is FBA. Dr. Feagin says, not surprisingly, too, white composers and other musicians have long been influenced by the melodies of African American music and by the innovative rhythms and lyrical style developed within black communities. Hundreds of white musical compositions and arrangements were taken directly from or inspired by this extraordinary creative music of black communities. So, this widespread cultural stealing, frequently without credit or compensation, reveals a pattern of appropriation, of theft, that parallels the theft seen in earlier minstrel traditions. You see it now happening with hip hop, with the Latinos, the white Latinos. They self identify as white. They don't identify as brown. They identify as brown when they want something from the black community. But on every census, everything, they even fought, and look it up. They fought for the designation of white, to be white. But anyway, I digress. Still, black music endured and evolved. It evolved, setting the foundation for nearly every major American music genre to follow, including hip hop. So, white denial of black musical influence. Despite the undeniable impact of black musical innovation on American and global culture throughout the early 20th century, many white artists and industry leaders, they actively resist acknowledging their creative debt. As black music began to define the sound of modernity through jazz clubs, popular recordings, and radio airwaves, Mainstream audiences embrace the rhythms, the melodies, the genius rooted in the black communities. Yet, despite this, open recognition of that source was often suppressed or denied or outright stolen. Dr. Joe Feagin explains the contradiction clearly. He says, from the 1910s to the 1940s, thus, the increase in integrated musical settings, such as nightclubs in New York and other major cities, spurred an increasing use of black music and musicality by white performers and composers. Nonetheless, apparently fearful of an honest recognition of their debt to black communities and musical innovations, many white songwriters, musicians, and producers then and now have pushed back against the suggestion that they have imitated or stolen black musical material, themes, and styles. Instead, many have openly rejected this debt or claim that they have only drawn just a little from black music traditions to make their original musical compositions. You see, this willful erasure, it reflects a deeper pattern of cultural appropriation without attribution, a tactic that is used to this day to minimize the foundational black American contributions while making billions from them. As FBA artistry continues to set the standard for musical excellence, white denial, it not only distorts history, but it attempts to disconnect innovation from its true creators so that they can profit from it and erase foundational black Americans. You see, FBA family and friends, and I know you enemies know this because you're part of the problem. One of the main goals is to erase foundational black Americans from the history of America. And so the last part of this section is enduring cultural effects of black music and musicians. So building upon the legacy denied yet never diminished, right? Black music has persisted as a dominant cultural force, and we will never be erased. We are not. We have scholars out there like Tariq Nasheed building on microphone check, exposing the hypocrisy and the attempted erasure of foundational black Americans. We will never let this happen. We are fighters, not fleers. So the dominant culture force, it's evolving, innovating, and influencing generations across genres and borders. From spirituals to blues, jazz to hip hop, the creative genius of foundational black Americans continues to reshape global land soundscapes, right? Even as it faces ongoing appropriation and marginalization. Again, we're still fighting the ongoing appropriation. Now you even have Asians saying they created hip hop. What's next? The Arabs and the Bedouins created hip hop? Dr. Joel Feagin affirms this legacy. He says, over the decades since the 1940s, black musicians and a few black record companies like Motown Record Corporation have continued to generate and innovate in popular music, including in the areas of blues, jazz, gospel, rhythm and blues, soul, rock and roll, and hip hop or rap. Not surprisingly, more contemporary African American music and related cultural practices have been influenced by earlier music and musicians. He draws from Charles Keel, who recognized the deep resonance of blues culture in various forms of black expression. He says, researcher Charles Keel has assessed the discernible impact of the blues background on numerous contemporary black musical choreography, choreographic and rhetorical practices, including in a performance by B.B. King, a sermon by the Reverend C.L. Franklin, a Moms Mabley comedy routine, or a John Coltrane saxophone solo. One could extend this insight to continuing blues, jazz, gospel, and rock impacts on a great array of contemporary artists whose music is often described within the hybrid labels of soul music or rhythm and blues, such as the great artists Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, Mariah Carey, Aretha Franklin. And that's why we always ask those who are trying to steal our music and our genres, show us a Michael Jackson, show us a Stevie Wonder, show us where you have an Aretha Franklin 50 years ago. You can't, because you stole from foundational black Americans. Feagin continues, this African American music too has continued to have major effects on the music of white America, especially as it is widely recorded and circulated by large white-run recording companies. The latter have also encouraged and assented white musicians borrowing again from these innovative black musicians. For example, in 1950s and 1960s, white rock and roll musicians such as Elvis Presley borrowed and stole heavily from black musical groups, including the innovative music traditions covered by the term rhythm and blues. So even in the face of structural exclusion and economic deprivation, black artists have continued to create beauty and cultural power. Hip hop, like the spirituals before it, emerged as a form of survival, resistance, and expression. As with 19th century spirituals, hip hop signaled the ability of foundational black Americans to create something significant and beautiful in spite of impoverished conditions. In areas with music programs and instruments, they innovated by using what they had, including old turntables and records. This is a FBA creation, not Caribbean, not Latinos, not Asian. Stop trying to steal from FBA culture. As Trisha Rose observes, hip hop began as a locally inspired explosion of exuberance and political energy tethered to the ideal of rehabilitating community. Notice she said a locally inspired explosion. Locally. It wasn't ideal by any means, carrying many of the seeds of destruction that were part of society itself. It had its gangsters, hustlers, misogynists, and opportunists. And rapper Jay-Z, he echoes the deep socio-political context often that's overlooked by critics. Jay-Z says, people can act like rappers spread these things, but that is not true. Our lives are not rotten or worthless. Just because that's what people say about the real estate that we were raised on. In fact, he says, our lives may be even more worthy of study because we succeeded despite the promises of literature or despite the promises of failure seeping out from behind the peeling paint on the walls of every apartment and every project. So again, despite the adverse conditions of foundational black Americans in the ghettos, in the so-called hoods, we created hip hop or rap music and hip hop in all its elements. So in the end, black music remains a powerful testimony, not just to artistic excellence, but to survival, identity, and truth-telling in a society that has long tried to silence and steal from its creators. So it's important to note a recurring issue in the work of Dr. Feagin and many other white so-called liberal academics. The tendency to conflate or tether broader African identities to the distinct cultural achievements and innovations of foundational Black Americans. For instance, Feagin and others, they attribute uniquely FBA creations such as the Charleston dance to generalized African origins without offering substantive empirical evidence. This interpretive leap, it overlooks the historical reality of cultural suppression under slavery, where enslaved individuals were often punished or even ultimately unalived for engaging in African or indigenous cultural practices. In fact, they would make, if they even heard you speak in your native language, they would make you eat rubber. Look it up. Don't take my word for it. So such assertions, it fails to account for the process of what you'll hear foundational Black Americans talk about all the time is an ethnogenesis or ethnomelanism, as I say in my research, that occurred under American chattel slavery, through which foundational Black Americans' identity, its culture, artistry were forged in a context of forced disconnection from African roots, from our native Aboriginal roots here in America. The Charleston and similar expressions were not remnants of African or the native blacks, but rather new, distinctly FBA innovations created under conditions of cultural erasure and oppression. So misattributing these achievements to an amorphous African past not only distorts historical accuracy, but it erases the unique creativity and resilience of foundational Black American people within the specific context of the United States, racially slavery and slavery resistance within that context. But Black genius doesn't stop at the arts. Building on centuries of musical, cultural, and artistic brilliance, it's critical to recognize that Black excellence, especially the genius of foundational Black Americans, it also extends deeply into the realms of science, engineering, technology, the mathematics. So Dr. Feagin states, historically, thus, African Americans have long played a significant role in the development of these countries' scientific and technical knowledge. There is deep historical background to this role. So, even amid the horrors of slavery, Black brilliance persisted. Feagin notes, even during the extreme oppression of the slavery era, there were significant achievements. One prominent example, and many of you may know about Benjamin Banneker, a largely self-taught foundational Black American intellectual born to a family of the formerly enslaved. He was allowed enough limited freedom to develop talent as an astronomer, a surveyor assistant. He actually helped lay out the District of Columbia. Some even say he is the architect, the main architect, the architecture of the District of Columbia. And as the author of best-selling science-based almanacs, he set the precedence for a lot of the science-based almanacs that you know of today. Banneker even famously challenged Thomas Jefferson on the hypocrisy of slavery in a written exchange that still resonates today. Feagin continues, among enslaved and free Black workers in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were hundreds of thousands of skilled workers, carpenters, painters, shipbuilders, ironworkers, and goldsmiths. These workers frequently innovated in the development of new tools and skills, including some of that were patented. Inventions which were often appropriated by white slaveholders and employers, of course, without credit or compensation. Feagin, he also stressed the modern legacy of black technical innovation. He said, although rarely recognized in mainstream discussions, a number of African Americans have played a pioneering role or other important role in the more recent development of U.S. information and cyberspace technology. Despite media focusing on the so called digital divide, Feagin notes that black technologists have made lasting contributions to Americans' creations. He writes, Dr. Feagin writes, since the 1970s, African Americans such as Roy Clay, Clarence Ellis, Mark Dean, and Philip Emeagwali have helped to make several Silicon Valley firms the pioneers in computer hardware and software development. As you can see, they sometimes conflate foundational black Americans with newly arrived Africans. And this is why it's important to delineate so that they don't lump us all in as one big Negro. Additionally, other African Americans have played significant roles in the development of the telecommunications industry, both within major firms and in passing key communications related legislation in Congress. So, from Banneker's 18th century stargazing to black innovation in Silicon Valley, the story is clear, FBA family, friends, and you enemies. Black Americans, especially those of foundational black American lineage, have always been at the forefront of American scientific, technical, and engineering advancements. These contributions by foundational black Americans, often obscured or intentionally erased in dominant narratives, must be uplifted and honored as central to the nation's development, not marginalizing it. We, as foundational black Americans, have to make sure our voices are heard. So, following the long legacy of scientific and technical innovations by foundational black Americans, from Benjamin Banneker to black technologists in Silicon Valley, foundational black Americans also left an indelible mark on the development of agricultural practices and ranching culture in North America. Dr. Feagin explains, African Americans provided numerous important innovations for other agricultural developments across North America. Much early ranching in the Southwest involved Mexican ranch owners and ranch hands before and after the Mexican American War of the 1840s. Yet, during the late years of slavery and throughout the early decades of the Jim Crow era, African Americans played a significant role in the development of southern and southwestern cattle raising and its cowboy culture. We're starting to take back some of these cultures, especially the cowboy cultures. As you've seen in one of my videos, I represented our cowboy culture. He continues, Dr. Feagin, later on in the 19th century, African Americans came to constitute an estimated 1/4 of Texas cowboys. Indeed, such cattle ranching. Feagin also notes, not surprisingly, thus one of the most famous rodeo figures in the 19th century was Texan Bill Pickett, whose father had been enslaved and who developed modern techniques of bulldogging, such that he was often billed as the world's colored rodeo champion. You see, FBA family friends, when we start to dig deeply and objectively into the history and creation of America, you see that black Americans built and are the foundation of America. So, despite Hollywood's whitewashed cowboy mythology, for example, black cowboys, many of them foundational black American descendants of the enslaved, were central to the development of ranching, technologies, livestock handling, and rodeo performances. Their innovations, their labor and expertise were essential to building Americans' agricultural success. Yet, their legacy remains largely hidden from mainstream narratives. Why do you think this is? But it's time to restore their rightful place in the story of American ingenuity and cultural formation. Again, FBA family, friends, and enemies, foundational black Americans built America. So, building upon the foundational innovations in science, technology, and agriculture, foundational black Americans have also made profound and enduring contributions to the literary world. Foundational black Americans' writings have served as mirrors of truth, tools of resistance, and blueprints for liberation, while simultaneously shaping the cultural and intellectual fabric of the United States. Dr. Feagin explains, African Americans have extensively influenced this country's literature, both directly and indirectly. In the 1920s, James Weldon Johnson, a major author and civil rights activist, argued that black Americans had long proven their artistic powers by creating the only things artistic that have yet sprung from American soil and been universally acknowledged as distinctive American products. So, from the oral traditions of enslaved foundational black Americans to the sharp critiques of contemporary black authors, literature has always been a strategic medium through which foundational black Americans articulated freedom, dignity, and humanity. These contributions, family and friends, not only enriched American literature, but it also challenged the dominant narratives and disrupted the Eurocentric literary canons. The following key areas help illuminate the scope and the power of black literary achievement. And those are essential analysis of racism, centuries of black literature, literary revolutions, the Harlem Renaissance, and pervasive effects on white literature. So first we'll kick it off with the essential analysis of racism, centuries of black literature. So as part of the broader literary contributions, foundational black American writers have consistently served as the nation's foremost critics of racial injustice. More than just storytellers, they have functioned as truth tellers. We don't just tell stories, we're telling the truth, diagnosing, documenting, and disrupting the system of oppression that have long shaped American life. Dr. Feagin says, since the late 1700s, critical black authors and writer activists have forced issues of racial oppression into mainstream discussions. Through essays, speeches, poetry, novels, and memoirs, these authors, ranging from Olude Ekwano and Frederick Douglass to Ida B. Wells, W.E. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and countless others, have held up a mirror to America's contradictions. Their work not only challenged white supremacist narratives, but also laid the intellectual groundwork for civil rights struggles, black liberation movements, and intersectional justice frameworks. So, in every generation, black literature has remained a vital force for social clarity, for moral reckoning, and cultural transformation, pushing the nation towards the ideal it so often fails to meet. Although it documented all men are created equal, it never lived up to that until FBA forced it to, and we're still forcing it to live up to that expectation or to that standard that all men are created equal. We push the democracy. Foundational black Americans are America. So, following generations of incisive literary critique that laid bare the foundations of American anti-black racism. The early 20th century marked a powerful cultural eruption, the Harlem Renaissance. This movement was not just a continuation of black literary excellence, it was a bold assertion of foundational black American genius across artistic forms. Dr. Feagin asserted during the era from the 1910s to the 1940s, there was an explosion of African American literature, drama, visual art, dance, and music, often called the Harlem Renaissance. This dramatic outpouring of U.S. artistic talent was distinctive and unprecedented, even more so because it came from a sector of Americans long framed by whites as incapable of such great creativity and genius. He continued, in addition, because most U.S. books and magazines, publishers, and other mass media were mostly controlled by white men, these media outlets usually had to be used in circulating products of the Harlem Renaissance to wider audiences. So, despite these structural barriers, despite the anti black racism, Harlem Renaissance artists created a new cultural language that affirmed black humanity, reshaped American art, and inspired global audiences. When we think about FBA, we have to think about it in a global sense because we are the culture. We are the global culture. The movement's resonance extended far beyond Harlem, redefining what it meant to be black and brilliant in a nation still struggling to reckon with its anti-black racial contradictions. And then the last part of this section is concentrated on pervasive effects on white literature. So, building on the creative explosion of the Harlem Renaissance, the influence of black struggle, or I should say, black life, black struggle too, and artistry extended beyond black communities and into the very heart of white literary traditions. As FBA writers asserted their humanity and genius, white authors they could no longer ignore or escape the centrality of the black experience in shaping American society and its narratives, no matter how much they run from it, how much they deny it. It's there. Dr. Feagin explained, not surprisingly given the systemic and foundational character of United States racism, black Americans and associated white-black racial matters have been central to white thinking and writing about this society since the 17th century. He cites W.E. Du Bois, who profoundly observed, in the South, he is everything. You cannot discuss religion, morals, politics, social life, science, earth or sky, God or devil, without touching the Negro. That's deep. This reality, it underscores how deeply embedded FBA presence and FBA resistance are in the cultural consciousness, even when filtered through the pens of white authors. Rather than existing on the margins, blackness has served as a persistent reference point, mirror, and even muse in American literature, shaping not only what is written, but how this nation continues to interpret itself. So that's the power of our story, FBA family. What began as oral brilliance through oral traditions born out of survival, resistance, and ancestral memory was never confined to whispered tales around the fire or coded speech shared in the cotton fields. It evolved. It took on new life in written form. The same voices that once spoke in hushed tones beneath the weight of bondage, the griots who cloaked truth and humor, irony, and layered symbolism begin to write. And when they wrote with clarity. They wrote with conviction. They wrote to remember, to resist, and to reclaim the narratives that have long been distorted. We continue to write that way. This moment marks a profound shift in our cultural continuum, from oral resistance to literary emergence, from survival storytelling to strategic authorship. Here, foundational Black Americans, descendants of freedmen, shaped through the ethnogenesis of Black Aboriginals, Africans, Red Natives, and Europeans, did not merely enter the literary space, we transformed it. We didn't imitate it, we innovated. We didn't ask to be included, we authored a tradition of our own. Just like with hip hop, we didn't ask them permission for a genre of hip hop. We created it. We didn't ask to be identified. We self-identified. We no longer will let them identify who we are. Now, let's examine how those whose voices were once systematically suppressed became architects of legacy. How the sons and daughters of the enslaved laid claim to language itself and carved a new lineage into the canon of American thought. Which brings us to the next powerful movement in this cultural symphony, Black sources of folklore and language. Dr. Feagin asserted, from the beginning of slavery and of necessity, African Americans developed a strong oral culture to pass along critical information in group settings and across the generations. He went on to say, an important part of his oral culture involved folk stories, including those that use humor as resistance against oppression. Humor often involving creative use of the English language. Excuse me. This is where you get they call it Black American English vernacular, or Black American vernacular English. And as Mel Watkins further explains, misdirection, pretense, cryptic speech, in fact, a long of homespun Socratic irony, loom prominently as characteristics of early authentic Black humor. This was not just entertainment, it was resistance. It was survival. And as Feagin rightfully notes, he says this humor was often couched in a creative dialect that those enslaved developed in dealing with the English forced on them. Now, let's pause right here, FBA family, friends. And yes, I see you too, enemies. And let's be clear, many of those who were enslaved did not come to this land fluent in the Queen's English. They were the product of Black Aboriginal, African, and Red Native lineage, a rich mix of people who were forcibly uprooted, stripped of their languages, and violently assimilated into a brutal system. Yet out of the storm, they didn't just survive, they created another language. I can speak in the slang that most of the dominant society would not understand what I'm saying. We formed a new dialect, a new rhythm, and a new voice that would carry the truth of our experiences from one generation to the next. And here's the beauty of that oral tradition. It didn't stay confined to verbal storytelling. Over time, it evolved. That rhythm became written word, that street corner storytelling, that sacred circle wisdom, that kitchen table testimony. It transitioned into essays, poetry, speeches, books, and rap music. So, FBA, family, friends, and yes, enemies lurking too, we've just laid out how the oral traditions of our ancestors evolved into resistance storytelling or truth telling, humor and coded language that shaped a unique dialect and cultural identity, foundational Black Americans' identity. This linguistic creativity wasn't just about survival, it was about laying the foundation for an enduring cultural voice. But as we move forward, let's not overlook another powerful domain where the same voice rang loud and unbreakable: spirituality. Because even in the depths of enslavement, when every effort was made to crush the body and erase the mind, the spirit of our people refused to be broken. And Dr. Feagin speaks directly to this when he says, even the oppressiveness of slavery had not destroyed their spontaneous expression, which took the form of deeply religious, spiritual, and other sorrow songs. Now pause on that. Sorrow songs. These weren't just emotional outbursts. These were coded messages, sacred rituals, and ancestral memory flowing through the melody and moan. And it didn't stop there, Dr. Feagin continues. In his path breaking, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois argues that African Americans blended elements of their African background with elements of their Eurocentric environment to create distinctive African American religious beliefs and practices. Now, here's where I have to weigh in, family. Dr. Feagin, like many so called liberal scholars, does a solid job at highlighting the African and European connection. And yes, it's there. But he still doesn't name what truly happened. An ethnogenesis, the ethnomelanism that I call in my research. The emergence of a new, distinct people, not just Africans adjusting to America, but foundational Black Americans born of African, Black Aboriginal, Red Native, and Europeans, forged in the fires of slavery and colonial violence, and shaped by both ancestral memory and forced Eurocentric exposure. So when Feagin says distinctive African American religious beliefs, he's pointing to that unique fusion, a spiritual framework that is ours, rooted in this land, in survival, in longing, in defiance, and ultimately in liberation. Now, FBA family, after digging into the sacred roots of Black spirituality, that soulful synthesis of FBA memory, Eurocentric exposure, and the lived experience of an emerging, ethnogenetically distinct people, we must recognize that this spirituality wasn't just a response to oppression. It became a force that reshaped the very landscape of American religion itself. Dr. Feagin brings this truth front and center when he writes, significantly from the first decades of Black residence in North America, Black religious movements have had important effects not only on Black communities but on religious movements in the larger society. Let that resonate. We're not just talking about adapting to religion, we're talking about originating, transforming, and elevating it. White America didn't just witness a Black religious expression, it absorbed it. It was influenced by it, and in many ways reshaped its own religious identity in response to it. Dr. Feagin makes this clear. He says, over the centuries, religious practices among whites have been greatly affected by African American religious practices. And then he draws on the genius of, again, W.E.B. Du Bois, who described the essence of what we brought into the soul of American religion. W.E.B. Du Bois says, a spiritual joyousness, a sensuous tropical love of life in vivid contrast with the cool and cautious New England reason, an intense sensitivity to spiritual values. That's us, family. That's foundational Black Americans' flavor in full form. A love of life that could not be crushed. A spiritual fire that burned hotter than the cold logic of Puritan restraint. And W.E. Du Bois, he didn't stop there. He laid it out plainly. He said, African Americans created a religious legacy of, he didn't say African Americans. Dr. Feagin said African Americans. Uh, they created a religious legacy of fruitful labor, of joy and music, of the free spirit, and of ministering hand of wide and poignant sympathy with men in their struggle to live in love, which is, after all, the end of being. So, as we move forward, understand this. Black spirituality didn't exist in a vacuum. It reshaped the national consciousness. It shook the very pews of white churches. And from it emerged one of the most impactful religious evolutions in United States history. Let's now turn to the next phase of foundational Black American and sports. So, after tracing the spiritual and cultural foundations laid by foundational Black Americans, we must not overlook another battleground where FBA genius reshaped American identity, the world of sports. Because our impact didn't stop at the pulpit or the stage, it extended all the way to the playing fields, the boxing rings, the racetracks, and beyond. As Dr. Feagin details in this final section of Chapter 3, he says, African Americans have been pioneers in breaking down racist barriers in numerous sports arenas, and more broadly, in moving the racist country in the direction of some real desegregation. In the process, they have changed the character of sports arenas that they entered. Let that marinate. Not just participants, pioneers, game changers, cultural setters. Feagin reminds us that even in the 19th century, Black athletes were excelling across a wide spectrum of sports. He says, although few know this history, in the last half of the 19th century, numerous Black athletes participated in and often did well in an array of sports, rodeo events, boxing, horse racing, bicycling races, track and field events, and early baseball games. Thus, Black jockeys won at least 110 important horse races between 1880 and 1905, including 13 Kentucky Derby races. That's right, family. We even were we even excelled in horse racing, something that has been all but erased from American history. Yet with success came the backlash. Of course, whenever we excel, and you can look at history, whenever foundational Black Americans have excelled, the system did what it always does when foundational Black Americans shine too bright. It tries to erase us. Dr. Feagin, to that point, says, nonetheless, they were forced out of these sports events by the late 19th or early 20th century by extensive Jim Crow racial segregation, backed up by the anti-Black violence and the aggressively racist framing of whites. Additionally, African American athletes were increasingly stereotyped as inferior in their athletic abilities. And that erasure, that push out, it still echoes today. Dr. Feagin captures the ongoing struggle through the powerful voice of our sister Rachel Robinson, who is the wife of the great Jackie Robinson, reflecting on the 50th anniversary of her husband's breaking of baseball's color line. She didn't sugarcoat the reality. She said this: I think he'd be very disturbed about it. We're seeing a great deal of divisiveness, a lot of hatred, a lot of tension between ethnic groups, and I think he'd be disappointed. She didn't stop there. She kept it 100 with wisdom and grounded optimism. She said, we would expect to be further along by now, and we're seeing a worldwide. I don't feel despair about it because I think despair and cynicism only undercut our ability to address these issues and do something about them. So I've maintained a certain level of optimism, but it's restrained by a realistic knowledge of what's going on in the world. Feagin adds in another sharp observation from Rachel. In another savvy interview, she noted the decreasing number of black Americans in the baseball leagues today and in the professionals as a serious societal problem. Now, let's build on that because it's bigger than baseball. What we're seeing across the board in sports and in music is an orchestrated campaign to erase foundational black Americans. You see it in baseball, basketball. Tune in. Baseball, nothing but Latinos. Baseball in the 80s, I remember seeing people like Willie Stargell and Dave Parker, um, uh, Sweet Lou Whitaker. Now you very rarely see a foundational black Americans. They have all been erased from baseball. Same thing with basketball. They're now recruiting Europeans, Africans, Caribbeans. They are erasing um, foundational black Americans from every sport and trying to do it with music as well. Whether it's hip hop being co opted by white Latinos or major leagues importing athletes from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and Latin America. The strategy is clear. Replace the foundational black American presence with folks deemed more manageable, more grateful, less likely to challenge injustice. What did they tell LeBron James? Shut up and dribble the ball. We've allowed you to make millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. You don't speak out about injustice. You let us continue the status quo while we give you money. That's what they think. They think that just because you make money, you're not supposed to speak out about any injustices. Because, make no mistake, it's not just about talent, it's about resistance. It's about voice. It's about justice. And that family is why they try to silence us, sideline us, and phase us out. They know that Africans coming in here from their villages, Latinos coming here from their favelas, they are not going to resist. Now they're out in California trying to resist. Foundational black Americans are like, no, I told you guys so. I told you white supremacy was racist. And now they're like, come on, FBA family, friends, help us. No. But the legacy, the impact, the genius of foundational black Americans that can't be replaced, that can't be duplicated. And as we close out this chapter, we must carry out the truth with us on the field, on the stage, in the academic world, and in the streets, because the culture does not move without foundational black Americans. Believe that. So, FBA family, friends, and you enemies, join us next time as we continue this journey through Dr. Feagin's groundbreaking analysis. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, black genius has always been the backbone of American greatness. The fight for FBA recognition is far from over, but through education, activism, and self-determination, we will reclaim our rightful place in history. Our ancestors built this nation brick by brick, law by law, institution by institution. And now it is our duty to secure the justice, wealth, and legacy that they were denied. The future of foundational black Americans' empowerment is in our hands. And together, we will shape it. Stay tuned as we continue to uncover the truth and chart the path forward. Please like the podcast, subscribe, share it, and comment below. Signing off, your brother and host, Dr. Muhamed. And these are the Dr. Muhamed Files.